talking about large gatherings, so let's start with the Moscow attack.
Yeah.
So far, we were told, ISSK, I guess, is the
Mm-hmm.
people who are behind it. But the Russian FSB, the former, that's the formerly it's the KGB, right? The FSB,
Yes, sir.
their head, Alexander Botnikov, he said just I think yesterday or the day before, he said the U.S., Britain, and UK and the Ukraine are behind this attack. Well,
Mm.
what do you say about that?
He didn't quite say that. What he said was that he couldn't rule out that
Okay.
Britain and the US were behind the attack. What he also went on to say, though, that the Russians have preliminary indications, as they put it, that Ukraine is involved. And the point he was basically making was that since Ukraine is so heavily involved with the Western powers, and since the Western powers have such a long history of backing terrorism in all sorts of places, it was not implausible that the US and Britain were involved in some way also. I don't think he was suggesting that they directly planned the attack, but that they're involved with the kind of people who do this sort of thing and therefore bear responsibility for it.
Yeah. Now, I think in China, there's a lot of talking about ISSK because
Mm.
we probably don't, I don't see much discussion in the Western media about the Central Asia. So there are people in China because some people also connect that with not that long ago, Iran had also a terror attack, a pretty big one.
Mm. Mm.
And so the Central Asia is where it connects Iran, Russia, and China. That's where it is. And of course, these ISSK, supposedly four of them are from
Tajikistan, yeah.
Tajikistan. Yeah, and so with that, so lots of people in the Chinese media saying, well, that's what they're trying to stir trouble. Now,
Yeah.
Afghanistan, of course, is a hotspot. I mean, it's always some problem there. And
Mm.
considering history with Russia in the past, so there is a possibility that the Western want to stir something there. And I mean, Russian probably will not start a new front just because of this, but they never really stopped, provoking things in Central Asia. Do you think there's some elements of that too?
No, it's absolutely true. There's no doubt about this. Now, of course, the thing about ISIS and ISIS K is that, of course, these are organizations that adopt these names and they move and
Uh-huh.
change, and all kinds of people overlap with each other. And one doesn't really know exactly who is what and what they're doing. But I don't think that anybody who is not fully part of the Western system, in other words, most people, would not deny, would agree, in fact, that the West has been heavily involved with all kinds of violent groups in Central Asia.
Hmm.
Remember, in the 1980s, they were sponsoring an Islamic insurgency against the government in Afghanistan, which was backed by the Soviets, and there was a war there. I mean, and this is not even disputed. So they've been heavily involved with all these groups for a very, very long time, and they continue to be. And it is also the case that the United States, especially, but other Western powers, Britain undoubtedly, have taken a very, very strong interest in Central Asia. And it's, again, difficult to understand why. First of all, this region is rich with resources. But secondly, it is at the hinge between, the Eurasian um, continent, and it's where Russia and China meet and where they're becoming friends. For a very long time, the Western powers tried to play the Russians and the Chinese off against each other in Central Asia. I mean, I've seen this. I've actually attended meetings where I've heard Western spokesmen and officials tell the Russians, aren't you worried about the fact that the Chinese are going into Central Asia and are establishing themselves there and are pushing you out? This is your former sphere of influence. That tells you what an unfriendly country towards you China really is. And you could see the Russians sitting and listening and saying, you know, we've got it all sorted out. We know what we're doing. We've worked it out with the Chinese. They have their areas of interest, and we have ours, and they're complementary. So, but I've actually seen those exchanges. So the West has been trying to play the Russians and the Chinese off against each other in Central Asia, and failing. And of course, it assesses the governments in Central Asia as relatively fragile and has been keen to mount disturbances and insurrections and revolutions of various types there, because they hope that in that way, this critical region will become destabilized and the Russians and the Chinese will have their hands full trying to control, put out the fires in Central Asia and maintain control there. So there is that too. And, again, this isn't something that is widely disputed. You'll find people in the West will dispute it, but it is true. It's also partly, ties in with what they're doing in places like Xinjiang region
Yes,
in
yes.
China. I mean,
Yeah.
it's the same strategy and the same narrative. So absolutely, ISIS-K hardly existed. Hardly anybody had heard of it until a few years ago. And then suddenly it appeared at precisely the moment when it was clear that the Taliban were going to win in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan was going to push out the Americans, and that the Taliban was going to look to China and Russia for help. So at that moment, suddenly we have ISIS-K appear on the scene, running a kind of insurgency in Afghanistan against the Taliban. And of course, it's also present in Tajikistan, which many people think is the most vulnerable of these countries because it is very poor. And so this strategy of destabilization and tension in Central Asia does actually exist. Of that, as I said, anybody who knows the region at all, they can see that. So the Chinese commentators who said this are absolutely correct.
Yeah, I think it is partially because of what you said, the Xinjiang part of it, right? That fit into all this. The Central Asians, I mean, not sometimes, but many times they're trying to stir something in Xinjiang. Yeah, and the Chinese government is very careful about that, very mindful about that. Just saying ISS itself, I just don't see the goal if it's just them to do it. I mean, what's their goal? Why do they all of a sudden want to do something like that to make Russia a very powerful country to be their enemy? I mean, why would they want to do that? I don't see the purpose there. On the other hand, the rumors that Victoria Nuland was pushed out partially is because she was planning on this. That somebody even in the State Department thinking this is gone too far. And she also said there will be some nice surprises for, and then just like when before they did something to Nord Stream, right? They said that several times, and so sometimes you just have to take their words on their face value, I guess. So I mean, who has the most motivation is my question, right?
Right. Well, let's first of all start with motivation and ISIS-K's motivation. Now, the narrative in the West is that Russia acts as a kind of security guarantor in Central Asia, does so with the, understanding of the Chinese. The Chinese are also there, but the Russians are principally there because they have long historic connections with the local security forces going back to the Soviet time. And that is why this attack happened, because they want to, ISIS-K somehow wants to push the Russians out of Central Asia, make the Russians doubt that Central Asia is worth it, create problems within Russia. There are large numbers of Central Asian guest workers working in Russia, especially from Tajikistan. And this is the strategy: create tensions between Russians and Central Asians, scare the Russians out of the region, and then, of course, you can go after the Chinese. That's the thinking. Others, and I have to say that I think this is probably part of the truth, think that this is just a commercial deal. That ISIS-K takes money and organizes terror events like this because they get paid to do it. And I've got a rather important source who has told me that very thing. He says that ISIS, since its caliphate in Iraq and Syria was destroyed, it's basically lost its ideological purpose. It's now become basically a kind of gangster operation. And I think that probably is true, by the way. I wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. But, there might be various motivations at play. But, the financial one is not, I think, implausible. The other ideas look very complicated, playing off Russians against Central Asians and that kind of thing. I've never been to Central Asia myself, but if you go to Moscow, you see lots and lots of people from Central Asia there, and they are absolutely part of the cultural and demographic scene. One doesn't get the sense that there's any significant tensions between them and Russians. There was a time, I remember, when a Tajik group gained control of Moscow's taxes. That was rather resented, but that's about the worst I've ever known about. So, I don't think this strategy will work, actually. In fact, I'm going to go further. I'm going to say that if you're talking about the community, the Central Asian communities in Moscow, they will want to stop anything like this happening again. And if they get wind that there are some people from Central Asia plotting these kind of things in Moscow, they are perhaps the most likely of all to alert the authorities. So, I mean, that's my own impression. So I tend to think that money motivation is probably the biggest part of this. Now, partly that might be trying to attract Arab money. Some people in the Middle East don't like Russia for all kinds of reasons, in Syria, in Iraq, whatever. ISIS might want to show to various big funders in the Middle East that it's still a force and can do these things. But of course, there's also the possibility that they're doing these things for, the interest of Western governments and all that. I mean, I don't know that that's the case, but it wouldn't surprise me. Now, about Nuland, the most interesting thing to say about her is that, of course, since she left the State Department, she has made no statement at all. She has given no reason for her own departure. And there's been much controversy about why she left. I am sure in my own mind that she was pushed out. I do think that more and more people in Washington were coming to the view that she was out of control and were becoming very unhappy about some of the things that she was up to. And of course, she went to Kiev, as you rightly say, and came out with this extraordinary press conference in which she said that the Russians could wait for some nice surprises, which is a creepy thing to say. And I think some people in Washington said, enough, you've got to go, and came and basically escorted her from the premises or something of that kind. So I think that is what happened. Whether that extended to her getting involved with all these terrible people like ISIS-K and her having contacts with them, which I think, by the way, if she wanted to have contacts with them, she probably has friends in the intelligence agencies who could arrange it. Just saying. But whether she did that, of course, I don't know.
Now, it is a little bit surprising to me, the security in Moscow, because the security in China, in Beijing, is much, I think, stricter. Now, sometimes there's another discussion in the Chinese media is it too much security? But when things like this happen, then a lot of people are saying, well, it's still needed. Now, partially, if you go, Beijing is particularly, I think, strict compared with other parts of China. Like the Tiananmen Square, right in the middle. When you get out of the subway, now going into the subway, you do need to go to security. They do run your bags and stuff like that. And then when you get out to Tiananmen Square in that general area, they're always checking. They actually scan you ID, or for foreigners, they do check your scan you passport. And you actually don't need to bring your passport. The passport picture is enough. They just want to scan it. So it is a lot of securities, but it seems like Russia doesn't do as much as at least Moscow. Is that a little bit surprising?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it surprised me, to be honest. Now, I should say that, again, if you go to the center of Moscow, to Red Square, the Kremlin, the area around, I mean, security there is extremely tight. You see lots of CCTV cameras and lots of guards, and there are people on the metro who will check your baggage and all
Hmm.
kinds of things. Now,
Okay.
Krasnogorsk, which is the suburb of Moscow
Uh,
where this happened, is more like a separate town. It's some distance, quite a long distance away from the center. I've never been there myself. Nonetheless, it is Moscow, and there is an important military industrial factory there, which makes optical equipment for the Russian military. I mean, advanced optical equipment. So one would expect that there would be, that there would be guards and protection there. I mean, it may not be in the center of Moscow, but it is connected to the center of Moscow through the metro. I mean, it's one of these suburban places. I think it's the only suburban place like that, which actually has a metro station that connects it to the overall metro system. So clearly there was a major security lapse. If you go to the Russian media, they are complaining about this. They're
mhm.
complaining about this still. One of the Russian newspapers went to various venues earlier today, looking to find out what the security there was, and they say that instead of proper young men who are able to deal with security issues, they found old pensioners and people like that, and it was taken very much, it wasn't taken very seriously. So this is actually, I think, over the next few weeks going to be a pretty big topic of discussion in Russia itself. So as I said, the Kremlin, the area around it, not just the Kremlin, but the parts of Moscow we all know from the film. There, as I said, security is very, very strong, but in these outlying suburbs, it's not. And of course, the authorities really ought to consider that and consider tightening control there too.
Maybe that's the reason they picked this place then, that they know in the heart of Moscow would be hard. So they picked this place that with a concert hall in there. My understanding is like a mall. It's not just a concert hall by itself. It's a mall. So there's a lot of people, including this concert hall. So
Well,
could be that's part of the reason they pick it there, right?
I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think it's
Yeah.
exactly why they picked this place. And again, I think that I mean, I've never been here. I want to stress this again. Until Friday, I'd never heard of this place. But my contacts in Moscow have told me that this is a huge complex. It's a huge entertainment and leisure complex. And this is one of the most, important concert, popular music concert stages. So, when big bands, of course, Western big bands don't go to Moscow anymore, but, Russia has its own bands. When big bands want to play and you want thousands of people coming and you want to have it in a closed environment instead of the open air, this is now a natural place to go. So given that that is so,
Mhm.
I would have thought that they would want to make it sure that this place was safe, and they didn't. And that clearly is a security lapse. The thing about Russia, and my sense of this is that it's more like that than China is, a lot more like that, is that Russia is extremely centralized. I mean, very, very centralized.
Mhm.
So, if the person in overall charge doesn't give the order, nothing happens.
Mhm.
If the person in charge does give the order, says, we must secure this area, it will be secured and very efficiently. I mean, actually, contrary to what people say, Russians, in my experience, are very efficient.
Mhm.
But it works very much from the top down. This is, very much the culture. Otherwise, without that central direction, nothing very much happens. And I think this was the case here. I'm sure this is going to be overrun now. I think that what's going to happen over the next few days is there's going to be meetings, probably not in the Kremlin, but in the Lubyanka, the FSB headquarters. They'll be bringing people together, talking to the local police chiefs in these locations, talking to all the various private security agencies, of which there are many in Moscow, and that there's going to be a radical upgrade in security from this point onwards.
Do you think more are coming? There are more this kind of thing. I mean, it's even though with the best, security, everything, it's still very
Mm.
hard to control everything, right? And so my question is, do you think more there will be more coming, more
Yes,
attempts at least?
yes, more attempts definitely,
Hmm.
and I mean, for one thing, they've exposed their lack of security, but going beyond that, I think in an odd way, this is going to make it more difficult to do this again, because as the security will be tightened up, and going back to what I said before, I think the Central Asian population, and this is a very networked community. I mean, it's there are community contacts and all kinds of things go on within it that they will not want to have their lives in Moscow disrupted. I mean, their wages are much. I mean, they make they're paid by their standards an awful lot for being in Moscow. They send big remittances to their families back home. They will not want to disrupt this, very lucrative situation for themselves by having it disturbed by people of this kind.
In general, I think public in general want peace, security, that kind
Mm.
of thing. Because in Xinjiang, when the terrorists happened in 2013, most of the victims are the Uyghurs. That's the thing that the Western media doesn't tell people. That these attacks they targeted the Uyghur population, the people living there. And so, for the majority of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang area, they don't want, they definitely not supporting any of these things, even though they might have, complaints here, there, and who doesn't, right? We all have complaints about our government, about our
Mm.
something, but that doesn't mean they support this kind of a, violent terrorist behavior. I think a majority of the people hate that.
I'm absolutely sure you're right. Now, I mean, I didn't know this specifically about Xinjiang, but it makes total sense to me. It was exactly the same situation in the Northern Caucasus. You remember there was in the 1990s and 2000s, there was an insurgency war there, terrorist movements, jihadist terrorist movements, Al
Hmm.
Qaeda and company, were very established in the Northern Caucasus, in Chechnya, and wherever, and the local people hated them. They absolutely didn't want them.
Hmm.
And there was one particular incident that happened in 1999, which I still remember, when a jihadi movement tried, the jihadi fighters from Chechnya tried to enter a neighboring region called Dagestan, and the people of Dagestan, who are all armed, I mean, this is heavily armed, it's part of the culture. The people rose up to join militia groups to drive them out because they absolutely did not want to see them in Dagestan. And the same, by the way, was also true in Syria. They don't want to see people like this because, absolutely, as you rightly say, the greatest violence these people do is towards the communities that they say they're trying to liberate. And what people want is peaceful, orderly, lawful government that
Yeah.
actually delivers for them. This is true in
Hmm.
Xinjiang region. Of that, I have absolutely no doubt. It's true, by the way, in Tibet. I've
Yeah.
just been listening to Ian Duncan Smith, one of our particularly crazed British MPs, talk about Tibet. It's true in Afghanistan as
Hmm.
well. It's true in the Northern Caucasus, and of course, it's true in Xinjiang region.
Now, regarding the Ukraine war, so
Mm.
I just a week ago, I read that Russia warns Romania for building this largest NATO military base. Why are they building it now? Clearly, everybody agrees, even in Washington agrees that this war won't last real long. I mean, they are pushing as long as they want, I guess, past November election. But everybody can see it's winding down. But
Mm.
at the same time, they're building this largest NATO military base. So it seems to me like they're preparing for almost like the post-war threat towards hostile towards Russia. Is that what the purpose of this largest military base in Romania is about?
I absolutely think that's exactly what it's about. I think that you're quite right. I think that quietly, privately, there's now a consensus in the major Western capitals, London, Washington, Berlin, that the war is lost, that the Russians are going to win, that the attempts to inflict what they call a strategic defeat on Russia in Ukraine has failed. So now they're looking for the next plan. Plan A was to destroy Russia with sanctions. That failed. Plan B was to engineer a military defeat of Russia in Ukraine. That's also failed. Plan C is to start an insurgency against Russia in what they will, of course, call occupied Ukraine. And I think this is what this base is about. It's about training people. It's about trying to perhaps occupy Moldova, a predominantly Romanian-speaking region that used to be part of the Soviet Union, which is now an independent state, and which they're very, very much trying to draw into the NATO system. So I think they want to do that, but I think ultimately the plan is to try and, as they say, bog down the Russians by creating an insurgency in Ukraine, and they need bases to train the insurgents and to provide them with some kind of protection and shield, and that is what this base in Romania is about.
Now, if everybody agrees that war won't last very long, why doesn't Ukraine just negotiate, start, kind of like a surrender? I guess we shouldn't use the word surrender, but trying to negotiate with Russia, because as the time goes, I just feel like every day the deal they get tomorrow is not going to be as good as the deal they get today. Am I right?
You're absolutely correct. I mean, I ask that question every single day in my video, the video I did for my program, my channel today. I ask that very same question. I mean, every day the military situation deteriorates. There's been a lot of news today about how things are going. The second biggest city, Kharkiv, has no electric power. Odessa, also, the shelling is taking place everywhere. The bombing is taking place everywhere. The Russians are advancing in the critical battlefields. I mean, why do they continue with this war? And, recently we had Li Hui. He was again trying to get the Ukrainians to understand that in their own interests, they need to sit down and start talking with the Russians. And the poor man, the response he got from the Ukrainians was an incredibly abusive comment from a senior Ukrainian official who perhaps for that reason was sacked yesterday. But it was just off the scale what this man said. Now, by the way, this is a man called Alexei Danilov. Some are suggesting that it was because of the Crocus City Hall attack and that he's some way implicated in it. I actually personally believe it's more likely because of that comment he made about Li Hui. I think there are still enough people sane enough in Kiev to realize that insulting China and its representative in that fashion is a serious mistake. So I think that was why he was sacked. This is my own view. I don't think it's got anything to do with Crocus City Hall. But the fact is, overall, the Ukrainians don't accept, they don't listen. And I don't understand. I personally don't understand why. It may be that some of these people have some kind of ambition to achieve a heroic, death or something of that kind. You do get that kind of thinking sometimes implant itself. It could be that some of them are frightened of some of the extremists around them, that they seem like they're disloyal to the cause. They will be targeted themselves. It could also be that they have financial reasons. I'm sorry to sound very cynical here, for wanting to keep this thing going, because as long as it keeps going, some financial aid comes from the West that can be laundered into accounts in the Bahamas, the Turks and Caicos, the Isle of Man, and whatever. And when things really fall apart, then the moment perhaps comes when they can dash off and get their luxurious retirements in these places. I don't know to what extent Chinese people are aware of this, but the similar dynamic played out in Vietnam, in that even as things began to fall apart in Vietnam, in South Vietnam, There were various people telling the South Vietnamese, you've got to start negotiating, you've got to accept that you're going to lose this war. And there's never been fully confirmed, but I believe this to be true, that there were approaches being made by Zhou Enlai at that time, who was always a man who looked for solutions. And he was basically saying to the South Vietnamese, this is the moment you've got to accept that you're going to lose the war and try and find some mechanism whereby you can achieve a civilized and orderly end. And the South Vietnamese leadership, who were utterly corrupt and extremely violent, completely rejected all of that advice right up to the day when Saigon fell. And it was only on that day, finally, that they actually communicated that they were prepared to talk. Literally on the day when Saigon actually fell, just before the North Vietnamese tanks arrived at the presidential palace in Saigon. So, it's something like the same dynamic. But I don't, we can describe this, but I think, as I'm going to say, reasonable people, I don't think we can fully understand the thinking here. To yourself and to me and to other reasonable people like Li Hui, it's obvious that they need to talk. But for some reason, they just don't seem to be able to do it.
Do you think some people, including some people in the US, they're just generally more comfortable in conflicts, in wars? Like once everything is peaceful, they don't know what to do. I mean, sometimes in the schools, there are those bullies are like that, right? They want to stir up trouble. So that's when they feel that they are performing best. They don't like things to be calm and everybody just behave themselves. Don't you think there are those kind of people?
No, I think you've put your finger on an extremely insightful point. I think you're absolutely right. If you read a lot of the commentaries, the articles that get written in, not the part of the American media that most people read, or the television places, or places like the New York Times or the Washington Post, even, but the kind of foreign policy journals of which there are many in Washington, you absolutely get the sense that these people are looking for a fight all the time, that they absolutely want to create violence and war and chaos in every single place that they can, that they don't want an orderly and peaceful and harmonious world, because they sense that in a world like that, the United States cannot be dominant. And beyond that, I think you're completely right. At some deep psychological level, they want it that way. I mean, they've become accultured to violence and conflict, and a world where that doesn't exist is somehow empty to them. Bear in mind that all of these people believe that they will never be held to account for all of this.
Yeah.
So I mean, this is so, but I mean, the bloodthirstiness, the violence of some of these people is really incredible. And I do interviews every so often with Professor Mearsheim. He's made that very same point to me. He said, you cannot overstate how confrontational and violent and belligerent some people in the foreign policy establishment are.
Yeah, and the past few days I was watching the Three Body. I don't know if you watch the Three Body Problems. It's very interesting. Now the big theme in there is this turkey farm, right? That all the turkeys are being fed every day at 11 o'clock, and so there is a turkey amongst the turkeys. There, scientists believe, okay, 11 o'clock we get fed. But then come Thanksgiving Day, the farmer came in, and that day there is no feeding. 11 o'clock, all the turkey got killed. Okay. And I actually think in real world, in our geopolitics, there are people who simply enjoy being the farmer. For us, all the regular people, Ukrainians, Russians, and even Americans, we just turkeys. I do think that they are people who simply enjoy being the turkey farmer. I think that's the psychology.
Absolutely, you're right. You're right. I mean, it gives them an enormous sense of power.
Yeah,
It makes them feel, that they're gods, that they can play
yeah,
God
yeah,
over other people's lives. And the way they talk about other countries, I mean, that we must do this there and do that there and force this country to change it. I mean, they play God all the time,
yeah.
and they're addicted to it.
Yeah, talking about that, I also want to ask you about Macron. Why is
Mm.
he so angry with Russia? Is it has something to do with the fact that those three African countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger or Niger? I mean, I don't know how to. Okay, Niger. Um, they have been pushing out the French, so that
Mm.
got Macron really angry, and he blamed the Russian for it. Is that what it is?
Well, this is what Putin believes. We know
Uh,
that he does because he had a long interview with a Russian journalist called Dmitry Kiselyov, in which they were talking about Macron, and which he was saying that this is what really basically comes down to this, that he's very very angry about the fact that um, West Africa is turning against France, and he's blaming Russia for it. And Putin apparently has had arguments with Macron about this, and has told Macron, "Look, this isn't something we went out to do. It's the Africans did this. I mean, they're tied with you for whatever reason, and they ask you to leave, and they come to us, and that's all it is. I mean, we're not got some kind of grand plan to drive you out of West Africa." But that Macron apparently won't accept that and won't believe it, and he's enormously angry with the Russians because of this, and this is one of the reasons that he's suddenly switched and has become so angry and hostile to the Russians altogether. I think with Macron, there are lots of things at work. Firstly, his political position in France is becoming very difficult. There's elections to the European Parliament coming. His party is expected to do very badly. Marine Le Pen's party is expected to sweep the board. He's got a very difficult relationship with Olaf Scholz, who's the Chancellor of Germany. And this apparently is a personal matter. Scholz and Macron just don't like each other. And so he wants to uh, assert himself against Scholz. And he also wants to position himself in some way as being superior to the Germans by taking an even more aggressive line against Russia than the Germans are taking. There's also a view that he's trying both to impress and at the same time annoy the United States, because the US apparently does not want to send troops to Ukraine, in the kind of way that Macron is talking about, and they do not want to see the French send troops to Ukraine. There's an article about that in Bloomberg today, that the Americans are actually angry with Macron about all of this. I can't help but think that the ultimate issue with Macron is vanity. He is a very vain man. And I think he feels that all kinds of decisions are taking place without him. That, the Germans, the Americans, the Russians are all involved, and he is not. And he's made this big pitch in order to get everybody talking about him. And I mean, I've I'm sure we both encountered people like that. And I think this is ultimately deep down what this is all about. I mean, it may be that he's saying to himself that it's about Africa, and it's about the Americans, it's about the Germans, it's about the Russians, and it's about the Ukrainians. But I suspect at some level these are just rationalizations. It's just attention seeking.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting you're talking about his relationship with the Schultz. The Chinese media also has some discussion about that.
Mm,
A few weeks ago, I think they had a meeting in Paris discussing the Ukraine situation, right? And it was during that meeting, I think he talked about the boots on the ground, that shocked everybody. But apparently, before the meeting, they had a conversation. And in that conversation, apparently, according to the Chinese media,
mm,
the Scholz accused the France for not doing enough. In
mm.
terms of the amount of money given, the support, the aid, I believe the number for Germany is like 18 billion or something, and France is only 600 million. And France also, in the meantime, selling a lot of the military, arms, etc., actually making money out of it, etc.
Mm.
So I guess, I mean, the Chinese media is saying that that conversation didn't go very well, that
No.
Macron was very angry. And that's pretty shortly after that they had that meeting. And then he started talking about boots on the ground. So he got
Mm.
defensive because of that. And he also, the other thing the Chinese media also talked about is that he also knows, like everybody else, this war is ending. He has to be active, and so that he could play a more important role in the post-war negotiation. That could be elements of that too. What do you think?
The Russians think the same, by the way. They also
Okay.
think that in some complicated way, Macron is trying to gain leverage so that he can pose as the effective mediator, broker, negotiator when the war ends. It's not going to work because the Russians don't trust him and don't like him. But I mean, there is a lot of commentary about this in Russia. So I think this is absolutely correct. Now, I have to say, and this is interesting because it's interesting that the Chinese are talking, the Chinese media are telling us about this argument between Macron and Scholz over aid, because I've heard about that, but I've never seen those figures before. And I'm pretty sure they're right because they correspond very closely to what I am hearing. But I didn't know that the difference was quite that stark. And I can imagine that that Macron would be extremely angry about being,
Called out.
exposed, called out by Scholz in that kind of way, and that might be, in fact, what caused him to flip. So again, he's a complicated man. If you, by the way, read his speeches or his speech, I mean, they're full of intelligent, clever, complicated arguments which never lead anywhere. I mean, this is the problem. In that, by the way, just to say, he's very French. I mean, there is a kind of French person. I don't know what's mean all French people are like this, but there is a certain type of French intellect that is like this. It's all appearance and form and elegance and sophistication and subtlety. But when you actually try and pin him down to anything, there isn't anything there. The Russians came to that conclusion, by the way, again, back in 2022, when he was coming to Moscow all the time, telling me, no, we mustn't stop this war. We can come up with all sorts of wonderful ideas. And then they would ask, well, what are those ideas? And then he wouldn't really be able to say. So he is a very complicated man, but as the key to him is vanity. And if he was called out by the Germans, then I can entirely see why he would have responded in this way, by trying to show to the Germans, well, actually, I'm the person who's really able to take the step forward and, take charge. And all you're doing is just giving a lot of weapons which get burnt up on the fields of Ukraine.
Yeah, Gaza. Okay, so it's a good news that the UN Security Council finally passed a resolution for immediate. Actually, it's not immediate ceasefire. If you read it closely, in order for the U.S. to not vote against it, because in the end, the U.S. just did abstain, right? So they actually changed the wording from permanent ceasefire to lasting ceasefire, which to me is not the same thing at all.
No.
So it's not really an immediate ceasefire bill, but it got passed. But my question is, how do they enforce that? Right?
Well, they don't. I mean, this is it. The key word in the Security Council resolution, which you find in all Security Council resolutions of this kind, is that the very last paragraph, if you read it, says that the Security Council remains seized of the matter. It's a legal expression. It means that it continues to have authority to decide what to do next if the terms of the resolution are not fulfilled. Now, despite this important watering down of the wording, about which you're absolutely correct, I still think this was an important step, because it is a call for it is a demand. I mean, the resolution says that the Security Council demands a ceasefire. So there's not yet an order, but it's just one step below an order. It doesn't say that, it doesn't call for a ceasefire, which would have been, just words. It doesn't order a ceasefire, which would have been mandatory, but it demands it, which makes it almost mandatory. That leaves it open for the Security Council to take further action if the Israelis don't do what the Security Council says. And the resolution is an international legal document. I mean, it is now part of the web of international law. The United States didn't want to go here, but to say it straightforwardly, they have been outplayed diplomatically. They've been outplayed diplomatically by the Arab and Muslim states. They've also been outplayed diplomatically by the BRICS states because they tried to put their own resolution ahead of this one. They thought that it would go through. China and Russia vetoed it. And they couldn't very well say that there wasn't, the situation, the world is too angry for them to go on vetoing resolutions. So they had to let this resolution pass. But how is it enforced? The way it's enforced, in theory, is that if it is not obeyed, there's another meeting of the Security Council. The Security Council then publishes a stronger resolution, which says that this time it is an order. And if that order is not obeyed, the Security Council will move forward to take action under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which is sanctions or even military action. There is no conceivable way that the United States will ever allow a resolution like that to pass against Israel. So at that point, we will again come to the stop at the Security Council. But given that we now have a Security Council resolution, which is part of international law and which is being vetoed, the pressure on the United States now is only going to build. And there also always remains the nuclear option for China, Russia, and the other states to go to the UN General Assembly and ask for a resolution to enforce this Security Council resolution under what is called the Uniting for Peace procedure, whereby the General Assembly takes on itself the powers of the Security Council and then orders sanctions under Chapter 7. So there are mechanisms to enforce this, but they're very complicated. And of course, without the United States, it all becomes very problematic.
Yeah. Okay, so now it is significant then that even though U.S. didn't really, voted for it, but the fact that it abstained, so let it pass. So it's still significant though, because it's moving closer to another direction that Israel, that's why I guess Israel is very angry about this, right? Israel want the US to veto it. Okay.
Yeah.
But
absolutely, yeah.
But even Trump is saying that Netanyahu really prefer Trump, I think, over Biden, and he really likes Trump. But even Trump is saying that Israel must finish up the Gaza war, and you're losing a lot of world, etc. And Canada now stopped, at least voted to stop providing weapons to Israel. So all these mounting pressures, but I still don't see Israel will stop. Israel said that we're just going to do it all by ourselves if we have to. So Israel is not going to stop, isn't it? And U.S. will not stop providing weapons. Is that right?
I think that is right. What is happening is that Israel is going down and is pulling the United States down with it. When I say pulling them down, I don't mean, towards annihilation or extinction or anything like that. I mean that they're becoming more and more isolated, and they're finding that their situation in the Middle East is becoming more difficult. And I think you're quite right. I don't think that Prime Minister Netanyahu's government is going to change course. I think that even if Prime Minister Netanyahu steps down, whoever succeeds him in Israel will be at least as hardline as he is. So I think the result of all of this is that we're going to get more of the same from Israel, just as you say. But that will increasingly inflame the Arab states. It will increasingly inflame global opinion. They will see that the authority of the Security Council is being flouted. The European allies of the United States voted for this resolution, even in Britain, which has, sided with the United States, abstained when it abstained, made many of the same comments. They too voted for this resolution in the end. And I think that what will happen after a certain point in time is that the process of Israel achieving normalization of its relations with the Arab states in the Middle East and other Muslim countries will start to reverse. We'll start at some point to see Arab states starting to break off diplomatic relations with Israel, so starting to drift back into a policy of confrontation, and we'll see the drift of the Arab states away from the United States slowly accelerate. In fact, not slowly accelerate, rapidly accelerate. And I think that is what's going to happen. So I think what the Americans will try to do, because there are people in Washington who are clever enough to understand this, is that they'll come and plead and beg and say to Netanyahu, please, please stop, please, please slow down. He, as you rightly say, will pay no attention. The administration itself isn't able to do anything. And so this process is now going to play out.
Okay, about China, what do you think about the TikTok ban? Okay, the latest now, the ByteDance, the parent company of TikTok, they said they're not going to sell. The Chinese law actually requires companies with Chinese consumer data and sensitive technology to have the government approval before selling to anybody. So the last time, that's how they got stopped, and then now even the funder and the major shareholders, I think they all came out and said they're not going to sell. So it's heading to a ban because it seems to me it's going to pass the Senate, and Biden said he's going to sign it. So how do you feel about this? And
Well, I think it's outrageous. What exactly has TikTok done? It's just TikTok. I mean, it's just. I mean, as I said, I don't know what goes up on TikTok, but I mean, it's a social media platform. As far as my contact with it, my knowledge of it, is that various teenage and student age people who are children of friends of mine use it to post videos and do that kind of thing. I mean, I think, I mean, there's all sorts of nonsense about how it's used for spying and propaganda and all kinds of things of that. Actually, the only real objection that there is to TikTok is that it's Chinese. That's the only one that there is. America controls all the major platforms, social media platforms that function in the West, all of them. Google, Facebook, Twitter, they're all American. They don't want a social media platform that is popular in the West that is not American. So that's why they want to stop it. And the fact that it's Chinese makes them even more determined to stop it, because they say to themselves, the Chinese can succeed here, they can succeed in other things. I mean, they might, heavens help us, actually create successful alternatives to, say, Facebook. I mean, I'm not saying that they plan to do that, but after all, they do that in their own country. So maybe they'll take all the technology, which is actually, if we are honest, more advanced than our own, and they might actually start to do that in the West, and we can't have that. So that's why they are going to ban TikTok. But the fact that one can understand the reasoning doesn't mean you have to accept the reasoning. It is a terrible thing. It's an absolutely terrible. It is exactly the same as the Huawei, the attack on Huawei. It's exactly from that same copybook. And can I say something? I mean, for a person of my age, this is such a weird reversal. I mean, I've lived with years of propaganda. We protect private property. Private property rights are sacred in our world. It's the bad communists over there. They're the people who seize property and do all of those sort of things. And I mean, there was a comment, I think, made by the Prime Minister of Hungary, or the Foreign Minister of Hungary. And he said the Americans are behaving like the communists are supposed to do, which is exactly right. I mean, I don't say the communists today do that. They don't. But the United States, it seems, is doing this. I mean, they haven't been able to make a coherent case against TikTok. There is no case to be made against TikTok. So nonetheless, they're going to go ahead and seize it, and notice that there is complete bipartisan support in the United States to do it. Republicans want it, Democrats want it, the administration wants it, Donald Trump wants it. It's going to happen. And it is terrible. And which country will lose? The United States, because they're going to have the same decaying social media companies that they've always had with their backward technology that dates from the 90s, and which isn't keeping up with that you're getting in China and indeed in other places too. They're going to be stuck with all of that, and you're going to see a state of atrophy start to take hold.
Yeah, and I just want to make it clear. It seems a lot of people don't understand that actually China never banned any U.S. social media companies. Both Facebook and Google, they chose to leave China themselves. China never said you have to, leave. Only after they refused to follow the Chinese law. China has laws like a search. You do need to have sensitive words that take them out and stuff like that. And then in terms of Facebook, it was actually during the 2013, the terrorist attack in Xinjiang, that some of those groups, the terrorist group, they use Facebook group to organize events, including telling their followers, okay, this time and this day, we're going to meet, somewhere outside the train station, carry this weapon, knife or whatever. They openly, organize things like that. And that's when Chinese government said, no, you have to close all these groups. And the Facebook said, no, we believe freedom of speech, those sort of thing. So even today, and the Wang Wenbin, the foreign minister spokesperson, he actually said that again. He said China welcomes any company to come to China to do business. We always open for business, but you need to follow the Chinese law. So that's the thing. Whereas TikTok never violated any Chinese U.S. law.
No,
that's the big difference. Yeah.
That is exactly the difference. That is the key difference. As every company must abide by the law of the country in which it operates. There's been no case made against TikTok in the United States whatsoever. I'm not aware of any big judgments in any, made against TikTok. But of course, you touch on an important point, because the United States sees its social media companies as instruments of its foreign policy. So, and in effect, that's really why, when they realized that they couldn't operate in China in the way that the US wanted them to, they pulled them out. But you're absolutely right. That was their decision.
Yeah. And they also, I think because they this social media company like Facebook, they kind of like having the backing of the U.S. government, so they feel like they can do whatever they want. So when the Chinese government said, no, you cannot do this and that here in our country, they were shocked. They were like, what? We cannot do that? Well, then we pull out. And they actually thought, I think Zuckerberg actually truly believed that China will back them to come back. I actually think that they actually believe that. But China just said, okay, if you want to leave, you leave, right? I mean, what's the big deal? I think now Google kind of like silently moving back to China with some of their businesses. In the initial pull out of China, they not just the search engine pull out. I think they put out other things too. But then they quietly pushing something back in China. That's what they did. In both cases, they really believe that China will cave to them. I think that's the arrogance of that too. Don't you think?
You're absolutely correct. You are completely correct about this. And again, it's astonishing, actually, that they think that. By the way, I can tell you another person, because I follow the story very closely. Another person who thought that was Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch wanted to establish a media presence in China. He made lots of steps to try to establish a media presence in China. He couldn't He was astonished when the
Mhm.
Chinese said, well, that's fine. You're very happy to have you here, but, you've
Yeah.
got to comply with our laws. He
Mhm.
said to them, change your laws because that's what I want you to do. And that's what he's used to having seen done in Britain and the United States and Australia, wherever it is. And the Chinese said no. And he couldn't believe it, apparently. And I mean, I know this. I mean, I know people who were there when it happened in Britain, and that he was apparently furious about it.
Mhm.
And I'm sure that Zuckerberg was the same, and all of the others. I mean, they are used to everybody trembling their knee, bending their knee in their presence, and coming up against China. It's always a shock, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay, I want to ask you about the ruling for Julian Assange.
Mm,
The British court said that Julian Assange extradition should be on the pause until U.S. guarantees no death penalty. I mean,
mm.
how can you really guarantee that? Once you have him send it to U.S. do whatever U.S. does, right? I mean, I don't. So is this some kind of delay tactic? Just they don't let him out. Of course, during the time when he's
Mm.
appeal or something, they're waiting for something. They continue to hold him in prison in the meantime saying, okay, we're waiting for some guarantee. Is that what it is? The delay tactic?
There's nothing good about this decision, in my opinion. I know some people are very happy about it. I don't see that there's anything good about it, because I think again you put your finger on the problem. The High Court has said that he has an arguable case for appeal, so that's what they said. But instead of listing a proper appeal, what they are saying instead is, look, we will list a proper appeal, but only if the Americans don't come back and give us assurances on these issues, which in effect is inviting the Americans to come forward with assurances. And the courts will accept those assurances, so it seems to me, whatever they are, and say that Julian Assange should not, therefore, continue with his appeal. And of course, if they make that decision, then the case ends. You see, if they allow him to appeal and he loses the appeal, he has a right of further appeal to the British Supreme Court. So another year of litigation. But if
Yeah.
they refuse him leave to appeal, then the case ends. He can't pursue further appeal rights, not in the UK. So that's what they're doing, it seems to me. It's they understand that he has a strong case. I mean, in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that he had a
Mhm.
very strong case. The judge who said that he should be extradited got it wrong. They can't really argue with that. But they're trying to find ways round so as not to give him an appeal. So they're coming up with this device telling the American government, you know, provide assurances. I've never come across anything like this, by the way. Asking the American government to provide assurances, asking any party to provide assurances. And if we're talking about the death penalty, British law here is unequivocal. Britain does not extradite to countries where there is even the smallest risk that the death penalty might be applied. The High Court has now accepted that there is a risk, however small, that if he's extradited to the United States, the death penalty might be applied. Given that that is so, the right thing to do would have been first to grant him leave to appeal, grant him his appeal, and refuse extradition. Instead, they're asking for what can only be a promise from the United States that they won't do that. And that promise, as you rightly say, is unenforceable. So I think this is terrible, actually.
Mhm. In the meantime, he's still in there, right? He's still in the
Yeah,
prison. They don't let
absolutely.
him out on bail or
No,
something. They don't do
no,
that.
no.
I think it's just so inhumane and so unreasonable, I think.
It's done an enormous amount of damage to Britain's international reputation. I know that British lawyers, when they go to international conferences, and British judges even more so, are constantly criticised by their colleagues in those conferences for the treatment of this man. But the British authorities and the High Court seem to be intent on carrying on.
And here is something also paradox about it, because we talked about many British, in particular, I guess, in the elite circle, they still like the empire, this concept of empire, the British Empire. This dream is still there, but they behave like a subordinate, right? In this case, if you an empire, even if you're just a normal country, you should have judicial independence, isn't it?
Correct.
But in this case, there is no judicial independence. Then how can you, on the one hand, you want to be an empire, on the other side, you don't even have a judicial independence? It doesn't work.
It doesn't work at all. And can I just say, when in the one place where there was some vestige of, well, not let's not call it the empire, but importance, was in the judicial system, because England is the country which is the founding country of common law. Common law of England. It's the basic law applied through most of the United States, Australia, Canada, all kinds of places. And the court which mostly interprets it and whose views are most widely followed, not just in Britain but around the world, is the High Court of England. And you would have thought, therefore, that you would want to enhance its prestige and protect its independence. But of course, they're not doing that. They're doing the opposite. And I think this is a very, very bad look to it. And by the way, even as they're doing that, even as they're subordinating their legal system to the United States and locking up people in Belmarsh because they've published articles which are critical of the United States in some ways. Even as they do that, they criticize other countries. They criticize Hong Kong recently and said that the Hong Kong system is now completely subordinated to China, ignoring the fact that Hong Kong is actually a part of China. But there we go. At least that is, what Hong Kong is. Britain is nominally independent of the United States, but its courts, it turns out, are not.
No, yeah, I thought that the people in the judiciary system would be very angry with the fact that the judiciary system is not that independent. I think that's tremendously important, right? The judiciary system should be very independent, even away from the British government, right? That's the idea of a fair justice, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. Well, bear in mind, I mean, I worked for 30 years as a lawyer in London, and for 12 years as somebody who worked inside the High Court. I used to know quite a few of the judges. I cannot begin to tell you how upset and demoralized I am about this. I would once upon a time have said this whole thing was impossible. It couldn't happen here. And it is happening here. And, I am deeply shocked by it. And it has changed my whole understanding of the world. It's that important, and of what is happening in the United Kingdom itself.
Quick question. How do you feel about the RFK Jr.'s running mate, Nicole Shanahan? I have to say, I'm underwhelmed by this candidate. I thought he would pick Tulsi Gabbard, somebody a little bit more clear to me what she stands for. I understand he wants to pick a woman, etc. But Tulsi is younger and and also a military person. So what's your take on this?
Well, I have exactly the same feeling about this as you do. I mean, I think that one way or the other, RFK has made one mistake after another. I think he left the Democratic Party too early. I think that he should have at least gone for some of the primaries before he left. I accept that probably in the end, I mean, he would have ended up as an independent, but I think he left prematurely. I think he did himself an enormous amount of political harm by taking such a very strong pro-Israeli stance.
Yeah.
And now he's made I think, basically discredited his campaign even further by picking somebody that, to be frank, has no great name recognition and no real personality. So I think that it's unlikely now that this is going to turn into much of a challenge. I'm generally sorry for this.
Yeah.
I've had one encounter with him. As a
Yeah.
person, I rather liked him,
Mhm.
but I have to say that I don't think he has the political skill and ruthlessness,
Yeah.
which is unique in politics, that his father and uncle did.
Mhm. That's how I feel too. I think he made a huge mistake for his support for Israel in the unconditional support for Israel. He should know better. He should know the people
Yeah,
who are who are really angry with the whole Gaza situation. Those are the people who support him. Many of them, the
exactly.
core, lots of the same people. They are his people. But he angered lots of them.
Exactly.
From there I kind of question his wisdom a little bit, like,
Yeah,
does he really know this? Why is he
yeah.
doing something so detrimental to his own campaign?
Mm.
So
I
yeah.
agree.
Yeah and other than money, I guess the whole idea is because she's very rich, right? This Nicole Shanahan, so that's what he bring
Which,
to the ticket, I guess.
yeah, well, I suppose it is, but I mean, again, is that really the image that a insurgent candidate wants to
Yeah.
make? I mean, I mean, a very rich person.
Yeah.
It's good to, I mean, if that is the advantage, I would have thought that wasn't really actually much of an advantage at all. Just saying.
Okay, something light. The Daily Mail, I'm sure you read that. The Daily Mail blamed China, Russia, and then Iran for fueling conspiracies about Kate Middleton. What's your take on that?
What conspiracies? What possible conspiracies? Everything that's been said about this business in China and Russia. Well, no, I mean, actually, the Russians have hardly said anything, but in China, everything that we've been discussing has turned out to be
Yeah.
true. We were telling the truth, and we called conspiracies. I mean, we both speculated that she was ill. We both speculated that she had cancer, and sure
Mhm.
enough, she is ill and she has
Yeah.
cancer. I
Yeah.
mean, going back to our previous discussions, the British authorities have mishandled this affair. They should have been much more open about her real condition. She is, after all, the Princess of Wales, the person who is in line to become our next queen. They took the decision to try and keep it all secret, which is an absurd idea. I don't know what they thought they were doing by taking that approach. I can only assume that they're very, very nervous about the fragile state of the British monarchy and the political system in general.
Yeah. I tell you what, it's kind of like a joke in China that believing that China is the one spreading conspiracy. I mean, Daily Mail itself has been speculated a lot.
Mm.
But what is actually people are
Well, that's a good
discussing? I
point.
mean,
That's a good point. The Daily Mail accusing others of spreading conspiracy theories when they do that every 5 times a day. But anyway, carry
yeah.
on.
Well, lots of people don't even know what we're talking about. What you're talking about, like Kate Middleton. Okay, what is people actually paying attention is here. I want to share with you now. Supposedly, William has an affair with Rose Hallenberg. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and so there's some pictures about her. So actually, people are talking about, if you look at the background, that there are Chinese
Mm.
artifacts about the picture she
Oh
posted
wow.
on
Okay.
her social media.
Let me have
So
a
you
look.
see the here and then here and then here is the
Oh
next
God. Yeah.
one. You see the behind her,
Yeah.
these
Absolutely. Yes.
artifacts are the Chinese ones. So
Mm.
these are the things, this one and this one. And then her husband, apparently her husband's grandmother is come from the Sassoon family. Now
Oh God.
The
I know them
Sassoon
very
family,
well.
yeah, the Sassoon family is being blamed for pushing for the Opium War, etc. So there's that element that actually in the Chinese media are talking about. So
That's a
I
very good
find,
point.
yeah, so
That's a,
I think they should report on that. They should
well, of
point to
course they
those
should.
artifacts, where that they coming from.
They should. I know all about the Sassoon family, who are, of course, famous in Britain. In fact, they're a legend here, and of course, they're always spoken about in heroic terms, which may
Okay.
come as a surprise to people in China. Bear in
Yeah,
mind, I've been to the Peace Hotel in Shanghai, which,
that's right.
as you know, one of them, the famous one built. So, I know all about the Sassoons, and for all I know, you're quite right. This is uh, shall we say, the fruits of what of their interaction with China before, which
Hmm.
Chinese people have very good reasons to remember, and probably not favorably. Just saying, but absolutely. I mean, that is exactly correct. Chinese artifacts. How were they obtained? I think we've discussed this before. I've said,
Yeah.
that British houses, stately homes, are stuffed with Chinese artifacts. Many of them taken during the 1860 and 1900 expeditions. I mean,
Yeah.
absolute war loot. So, I
Yeah.
mean, it is all over the place here. And I understand that, because I actually looked into this after one of our discussions, but apparently the British were strongly backing Yuan Shikai, for example.
Hmm.
And during that period as well, I mean, they basically ran Yuan Shikai, and they took lots of things from China at that time. And it was British influence in China was at its peak in the 20s before the Americans really started to quietly push them out. And again, I mean, this looting of China continued then. And I'm sure the Sassoons were profoundly implicated in all of this.
Yeah, when I saw those pictures, I immediately thought what you told me that lots of the British royalty and or high class families they have
Mm,
there are
mm.
plenty of those things, and that's when I thought. But is it true the Sassoon family? They are the ones who did the opium trade, and then once the opium was banned in China, they are pushing the British government to start the Opium War. Is that right?
Oh yeah,
Is that
absolutely. I mean, and lots of British companies that are involved in all kinds of well-known companies here in Britain were implicated in all of this. I mean, there is this is not controversial.
mm-hmm.
I'm just trying to remember. There's one very famous company, but the name escapes me, which is well established and famous in Britain. And of course, if you look into its past, it was heavily implicated in the Opium Wars. The proceeds of those wars still make, still account for a very large part of people's wealth, of the elite's wealth here.
And actually, same can be said for some of the American families, which I didn't know
Mm,
before.
mm,
Because even when I was in China learning the Opium War, there's most talking about the British role,
mm.
right? But actually, there are plenty of Americans. Their family fortune also started the Opium War, including
Oh,
FDR, right? FDR's
yeah.
grandfather from his
This is
mother's side, right?
this is
That's
this
how
is
he made money.
This is completely true. Can I just say, of course, there's never been a proper accounting of this. And I will say one thing about the Americans. So this is not in any way to excuse what they did, but at least in America, there is, I sense, a greater sense of engagement and openness and real interest in China than you ever got in Britain. So the British went there, they looted the place, they got all of these artifacts, but they never took China as a country and a nation and a culture particularly seriously, whereas the Americans did. And
Mhm.
one example is that the Americans were much more interested in Chinese art and Chinese music. And I were very interested in Chinese art. Nearly all the books I have discussing it, which are in English, apart from a few which are Chinese and translated into English, but all of the others are American. Whereas you don't find that in Britain so much.
Oh, okay. And it's interesting
The
because,
British, it's very interesting because the British tend to focus on items, Chinese items,
okay.
which are different. They're very interested in lacquer, for example. So you find,
Oh,
like you saw in those pictures. I mean, you saw those lacquer screens,
uh-huh.
for example, which are, they're I'm not saying that they're not important artifacts, but they're not the things that I think Chinese people would place the greatest value on.
Uh-huh.
But the British took them because they look
Oh,
rich and they're
okay.
attractive and that
Okay.
kind of thing. So, they also took lots of clothes, for
Uh-huh.
example. I mean, they went into the palaces and took, all the robes that the officials had.
Yeah.
And it was apparently the fashion at one time to have them as dressing gowns, which I find very, very strange because I can't imagine they were very popular. But people used to wear them indoors.
That's well, that's funny. That's
Mm,
interesting.
yeah.
Yeah. There's still, I mean, even though I thought I read a lot, but there's still a lot to be learned during the Opium War, I think. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
there's still so much. interesting part, because my understanding that even in Britain, selling opium was at the time was controversial, and that's part of the reason the British royal family decided to not allow private company to do it, but they set up the
East India Company.
Yeah, East Indian Company. That's what they did. That's a British state company, right? Or the royal family.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's not a private.
Set up by royal charter, by act of parliament, in fact. But you're absolutely correct. The selling of opium was extremely controversial, and the Opium Wars were very controversial in Britain. But the people who protested and opposed them were overwhelmingly working class people, many of them from strongly religious families or proto-socialist families. The same people who campaigned for the abolition of slavery. In other words, they were from outside the establishment.
Yeah, and that's give the US, the individuals, the opening. So they went there privately, like FDR's grandfather, Warren Eleanor, from his mother. So he, among others, he went there to did. Yeah, that's how it worked. I didn't know that until later. I read some books about it. So it's very interesting. Yeah, but that's give you the idea. That's what the real good discussion, once they started talking about Kate Middleton, about the, William has an affair. Okay. Oh, then everybody pay attention to the background, all those artifacts, instead of talking about where is Kate Middleton.
Well, it's understandable, because what you see there is the history of the Chinese people. And of course, you have, as I said, all these houses stuffed with Chinese art, and a political class which is antagonistic to China, whose cultural treasures it has appropriated. And there's a famous quote, sometimes attributed to the Russian writer Dostoevsky, which is that we hate those we have wronged. And I think there's a lot of truth there. A lot of the issues that the Americans and the British have with China is because they're very uncomfortable. They deep down, they know how wrong their past, their interactions were.
Yeah. I'm just saying that they should discuss that instead of blaming China for spreading conspiracy theories. And China, Russia, and Iran, and they blame on these three countries. I find that's just funny.
It is funny. I mean, also, the idea that people in China are really worried about Kate Middleton is just a ridiculous one. the idea that anybody in the world outside Britain worries about Kate Middleton is hilarious, actually.
Okay. I'm going to let you go. Thank you so much. It's really so enjoyable talking to you.
Before you do, an extraordinary big article in the Financial Times today, and its title. This is the Financial Times. Will Xi's manufacturing plan be enough to rescue China's economy? I was just reading this just before we started this program. Rescue the Chinese economy. What are they talking about? I sometimes think I'm living in a completely different planet from these people. He's growing at 5% a year. What kind of a rescue does it need?
Yeah.
We are in recession. Productivity here is falling. Living standards are falling. And it's the Chinese who need rescue. It tells you how, as I said, upside down and twisted our understanding of things in the West, in Britain, has become.
Yeah. Do you think Britain, by the way, is going to follow the TikTok ban? And Australia said they're not going to follow that. But do you think Britain would do that? Canada would do that?
That's a very good question. A lot of young British people use TikTok. It won't be popular with them at all. And I think that in an election year, they won't do it, to be honest. And I think the Labour Party will oppose it, precisely because many of the young people who they want to have vote Labour would be angry. What will happen afterwards, I don't know. Generally, I'm sorry to say this, the British end up doing what the Americans tell them. It's demeaning and ridiculous, but very ugly.
I think for me, I don't understand is that, like you said, it's an election year, and in the TikTok, there are 5 or 6 million small businesses who are using TikTok as their, one way or another helping them. why are they doing something like that to upset these people? You know, I don't quite get that. It's just ridiculous. They're
It
trying to
is
hurt
ridiculous.
China, but they are really actually hurting real Americans.
Quite right, absolutely. But this is the story of what the Americans and the Europeans have been doing. I mean, they've launched an enormous sanctions war, which has backfired against them catastrophically. They're talking about more sanctions. I mean, they've got a sanctions war against Russia that went terribly wrong,
Yeah.
and they're now starting this pressure on China,
Mm-hmm.
which China will absorb this. I mean,
Yeah.
I've no doubt about that. By the way, what the West will do if they see this thing through just doesn't bear thinking about. I mean, what it will do to the West, I can't imagine. And I know businesses in Britain and in France even more that have been destroyed
Mm-hmm.
by the sanctions. And Germany's economy is in serious trouble. And one of the key growth drivers was its trade with China.
Mm-hmm.
It's difficult to understand at all what these people are thinking and what they're doing. But hey ho, it's the Chinese economy that needs rescue. I mean, that's
I'm going to read that article. Okay.
yeah.
Thank you.